Dirty Politics, Hard Times, a Trilogy of Chartism, Book 3, Daniel Akroyd's Revenge. Chapter 6. As William Mather predicted, the engineering employers went ahead with their plans, determined to destroy the Amalgamated Society of Engineers. However, they soon discovered the new union was no pushover, and, unlike the general strike of 1842, it took many months to reduce the workers to the point of defeat. The ASE had many members working as maintenance engineers, looking after steam engines and a variety of complex machinery in a spectrum of industries the engineering employers had no jurisdiction over. These continued to pay part of their wages into the union strike fund to support their comrades. Despite this, the employers were determined to pursue their war of attrition, and inevitably a lack of funds and consequent starvation forced the end they sought. Most workers returned to their old places of employment, having signed the declaration the employers demanded, renouncing their union and declaring they'd neither join nor form another. Throughout the dispute, Mathers remained in production, as did quite a number of engineering firms, both in the Manchester area and further afield, all of whom had members of the ASE working for them. Thus, the Society of Engineers finally emerged from the dispute substantially weakened, but far from broken, and soon regrouped. Many members who had returned to work on the employers' terms remained in the union secretly, feeling no obligation to comply with statements they had signed against their will and under maximum duress. Many more were to rejoin within months. The employers had given the workers a bloody nose, but they'd also taught them a hard lesson. In short, the employers made a lot of enemies and few friends. They might crow over their short-term victory, but their vicious use of a lockout would prove to be completely counterproductive in the longer term. Amongst those who refused to return on the employers' terms were David Morrison and 26 of his workmates at the Great Western Railway Works in Swindon. David, Janet and their children travelled to Manchester in the spring of 1853 and stayed with their old friends for a week, during which time they renewed contacts with other friends in the town. David informed Irene Rose and the rest of the household he felt as though he was banging his head against a brick wall in England. He wanted a better life for his family, and they decided to migrate to New South Wales in Australia. He had contacts there amongst Chartist friends with whom he kept in touch. They would guarantee him employment and a house in Sydney. From all the reports they'd sent, Britain's penal colony was actually a land of opportunity. Irene Rose had shown concern, worried how they would manage financially, but Janet had assured her this wasn't a problem. A Christian socialist group had raised over £1,000 to pay for the passage of the 27 families, with sufficient left over to set them up with a new beginning once they arrived. They'd eventually sailed in the summer, and Irene Rose had been awaiting a letter from them ever since. However, she knew it would be a long wait. Nonetheless, time passes, and in the spring of 1854 the moment came. "There's a letter for you, Rose. It's from Australia." Matthew Edrose smiled as he passed the envelope over. "That's one less thing to worry about. At least we know they arrived safe." Irene Rose frowned and walked over to the writing bureau to retrieve the paper knife. "It's from Janet," she said, looking thoughtful. She'd recognised the writing as she slit open the envelope. "Has David sent you one?" "No, but I dare say there's one in the post. He either writes to me or Michael and asks us to inform the other, or at least he did when they lived in Swindon." Irene Rose began to read, and then walked back towards her father to sit down opposite him. "What does Janet say?" "You can read it after me, father. It's a small book." The letter was rather long, but Matthew insisted she read it aloud. The first thing Irene Rose noticed was the address. It sounded very English. Rose Cottage, Piermont Street, Balmain, Sydney, New South Wales, Australia. She wondered why they hadn't chosen something a little more Scottish. 1st of November, 1853. "Dear Rose, as you will have gathered, we arrived safe and sound in Sydney after 112 days at sea. All 27 families are well. David and the children send their love and best wishes. It seems like a lifetime since we left Gravesend. We had some terrible weather, and David was as sick as a dog for days on end. I kept telling him to go up on deck and focus on the horizon. My dad told me that was the way to avoid seasickness many years ago. Mind you, we were in a rowing boat on Loch Lomond in perfect weather at the time. Despite this perfectly sound advice, David couldn't face it, languished in our small cabin, and suffered as a result. That's men for you. Anyway, we finally made it and have a nice little house in a small area of Sydney named Balmain. There is no shortage of space here, and no shortage of land to build on. Consequently, living conditions are wonderful compared with Irish town, Little Island and Ancoats. There's no problem obtaining work here either. In that respect, it's a worker's paradise. Instead of 10 men chasing one job, it's more like 10 employers chasing one man, and skilled men are at a premium. It was the 30th of June when we set sail from Gravesend on the Francis Walker, and a typical English summer's day. It was raining, but it was the 19th of October when we set foot on land again, the end of the Australian spring, and it was like a hot summer's day. They don't have weather here, just a climate that changes by the season, not day by day. The summer is hot, but we're acclimatising. The landscape is far different from home, as is the flora and fauna. Robert has discovered he has artistic talents and produces wonderful and very accurate pictures of flowers and shrubs. We have gum trees in our back garden, inhabited by koalas. I will send some of Robert's work in my next letter. The beaches are magnificent, and we are constantly having beach parties and picnics. Yes, we have leisure time, a commodity unknown amongst the labouring people of England. Despite their seasickness, David and the rest of the men celebrated the night we crossed the equator by holding a meeting at which they formally inaugurated the #1 branch of the Amalgamated Society of Engineers of Australia. What they didn't know was they were forming Australia's first engineering union, and it is growing rapidly. David has a good job, but he thinks the engineering industry here is very backward. He's now in discussions with one of his trade union colleagues who made the crossing with us, Ted Halliday, with the intention of setting up their own business, Halliday and Morrison. They intend to only employ union members, particularly those blacklisted by backward employers. But time will tell if this comes to fruition. First, we need to earn money to build up savings. Unlike England, it's actually possible to hold down one job and save money without starving or even stinting oneself here. People are very friendly and helpful. Class barriers virtually non-existent. Everybody mucks in together. The few English masters who do cling to their old airs and graces are given short shrift and are only endured as rather sad figures of fun. As you can appreciate, because of the numbers transported here, plus those who've migrated to escape hunger or to escape arrest to a place of safety or to make a fresh start like David and myself, the Irish, Scots and Welsh are numerous, and I feel at home. I hear somebody speaking and suddenly think I'm back in Glasgow or Manchester, and then realise the air's clean, the sun's shining and it's warm. Chartists are everywhere, and we have a thriving branch of the association here in Sydney. I'll be very surprised if we don't win universal suffrage before you do in England. Over 100 men have been transported here for Chartist activity back home since the great demonstration on Kersal Moor in 1838. And there are at least 1,000 more from earlier struggles for reform, especially the so-called swing riots. Many have completed their sentences and have decided to stay. Most of their families joined them when they were transported or shortly after. As a result, Australia is uniquely blessed with some of the finest political intellects the working class has produced. All of them are free to work and to play their part in Australian life, even those sentenced to life transportation. Many Australians view a sentence for fighting for democratic rights as a badge of honour. I will write again as soon as I have more news, but I am glad to report we are all very happy and looking forward to the future with great optimism. Please remember us to John Doughty, James Leach and Richard Pilling, and all our other friends in Manchester. not least Michael, your children, and your wonderful father. Give a special hug to young Daniel Akroyd for me. David's really pleased he's decided to pursue a career in engineering, and he was very impressed at the way he has matured and developed over the years we were in Swindon. Both you and his father can take great pride in him. You've done a wonderful job in supporting and educating the lad over the years, Rose, not least because you've managed to enable him to retain and take pride in his working-class roots. If he had seen himself as an object of charity, it could have been devastating for the youngster. You're an example we all wish to emulate. Once Halliday and Morrison's established, there's a home and a job for him here, if he ever feels the need to visit. All my love, yours affectionately, Janet Morrison. Well, I must say Janet certainly sounds happy. Let's hope all her hopes will be fulfilled. They haven't had it easy over the years. Do you remember when David was awaiting trial in Lancaster, and he told Janet not to worry, they'd probably end up in Australia? Matthew nodded. Yes, I do. Well, if they hadn't released them, they'd have been out there 10 years ago. From what Janet says, it would have been a blessing rather than a punishment. David also maintained that they'd win the demands of the Charter in Australia before we did here, and now Janet's there, she's saying the same thing. Do you think they're right? I don't know, Father, although what Janet says makes sense. Chapter 7. Young Daniel had been intrigued by the idea of going to Australia, but Irene Rose had provided him with good counselling, urging him to complete his apprenticeship. Once he was a time-served craftsman, the world was his oyster, she pointed out. He'd seen the sense in what she'd said, and had kept his head to the grindstone. Under Bill Holland's expert tutelage, and inspired by his infectious enthusiasm, both Daniel and young William Mather continued to flourish. Another year had passed by. It was late 1855, and Daniel was entering the 5th year of his 7-year apprenticeship. William Mather had kept a fatherly eye on the youngster's progress, more than impressed by the lad's positive attitude to work and his eagerness to learn. On Bill Holland's advice, he'd given the lad an increasing amount of responsibility and kept him away from direct involvement in the production process. Bill had realised Daniel had a creative mind, as well as the ability to put his ideas into practice. Consequently, William Mather kept him working on research and development. He happened to be destruction testing some new steel bar they'd taken delivery of from their regular supplier in Sheffield to discover its ultimate tensile strength, when young William interrupted him. "Daniel, me feyther wants to see you." "What's it about, William? Anything serious?" "Who knows, but he didn't seem in a bad mood. Your dad never does, until he's ready to catch you by surprise." He tried wiping the oil off his hands with an oily rag with limited success, and made his way out of the department, weaving his way between partly assembled machines. Within moments he was making his way down the corridor with its dark oak-panelled walls, and knocking on William Mather's door briefly before entering. Old William sat on the window-sill, surveying the landscape outside his domain. Not that the view was up to much. It was raining. Daniel could tell. You couldn't see the hills. If you could see them, you knew it was about to rain, he remembered Aunt Rose telling him. The employer turned and smiled. "Do you still live in Ancoats?" "Yes, sir." "Do you know where Beehive Mill is?" "Yes, but it's not in Ancoats, it's in Mars Platin, but that's not far from Ancoats, is it?" "No, sir, it's in walking distance. I can get to it up the Rochdale Canal." "Right, then thou art man for th' job." He smiled, took his bum cheek off the windowsill, walked over to his desk, and passed Daniel a folder. "Spend a bit of time studying that." Daniel looked down at the file and began to open it. "Not now, lad, when they get home. I want you to leave now, because at 7:30 tonight I want you at Beehive Mill." "But it's only 2:30. "No matter, you'll need time to study that afore you go. You'd best do it at home, where there's no distractions. Anyway, I'm not paying you overtime, so make best at time they've got. They want to install 2 of our latest calico printing machines. I need you to meet mill owner and go up job with him. He's going to have limited time available to have the machines installed. A quick in and out job so we don't lose production time. It's all to be done within a week, when he's finally made up his mind to have it done. Thou art a sensible lad. They should know what's involved by now. Prove I'm right, given the responsibility, and I'll make sure you don't lose out." The lad grinned, remembering the discussion when he'd been making his first set of tools. "Another test, is it, Mr. Mather?" "Another test? What do they mean?" Daniel shook his head. "It doesn't matter, sir. I'll do the job for you, as best I can." "Good lad. I can't ask for more than your best, and I won't put up without else. Now be off with it. Don't forget, 7:30 prompt." The lad turned and was about to open the office door to make his departure, when he had a second thought. "Who do I ask for when I get there, sir?" "West. Nathaniel West," came the swift reply. "He said he'd be waiting outside main office entrance." Daniel nodded, left the office, and closed the door. He no longer had a smile on his face. Nathaniel West. The time has come at last. He took a deep breath before proceeding on his way back to the workshop and his bench. He'd best finish the job he'd left as quick as possible. "Constance, there's a friend of thine in cafe." The mill owner's adopted granddaughter looked up at Susan Openshaw, taken by surprise. She was in the middle of changing a thingamajig. "A friend? At this time of day?" "I think you should have a break as soon as you've finished that. I'm just making a pot of tea for him." "But who is it, Susan?" "If I told thee, it wouldn't be a surprise, would it?" Daniel sat in Mary's kitchen, having decided to eat there rather than at home. The cafe was well lit, and he could relax and study his documents before proceeding to the beehive. He wondered if West was the owner or merely the mill manager. Not that it mattered. Soon he'd be neither. He pulled the papers out of the file and began to study them. A pot of tea on a tray, complete with 2 cups and saucers, landed in front of him. He looked up into Constance's smiling brown eyes. The lad grinned and waited for her to sit down. "How are you, Daniel? And what are you doing here?" "I'm very well, Connie. I've a job to do." She began to pour the tea and passed him a cup. He reached for the milk jug and, having topped his tea up, stirred in a spoonful of sugar. She did the same, lifted the cup to her lips, and blew across the top. She looked at him inquisitively through the vapour. "What kind of job?" "I've to meet somebody at the beehive at 7:30 to discuss an order for printing machinery." "That sounds interesting. What will you be doing after?" She gazed into his eyes, and he felt she was looking into the very depths of his soul. He hoped she couldn't see the dark spectres lurking there. Constance had now turned 16. She was the most attractive, beautiful young woman Daniel knew, apart perhaps for his old friend Emma Chadwick. He also knew for sure he'd fallen head over heels in love with her. Unfortunately, Constance nowadays seemed to have eyes for another, much to Daniel's discomfort, not least because it was his close friend and workmate. "I'll be going straight home. I've to be in work for 6 in the morning," he replied, somewhat defensively. "So do I," Constance reminded him. She was now a fully paid-up member of Mary's Kitchen Workers' Cooperative, assigned primarily to nursery duties. "I just thought we could meet later," she continued. "There's a social here tonight to raise money for one of the spinners who's off work sick. It will still be going strong when you've finished at the mill with a bit of luck." She smiled. "You could walk me home, maybe," she added hopefully. Daniel found himself taken aback. "Aren't you seeing William Mather? You've been entertaining him quite a lot recently." "The Mathers visit my parents, that's all." "I must have dreamt William telling me about the visit to the Palace Theatre and the Art Gallery," he retorted. She gazed into his eyes again for a moment, before looking down at the tabletop somewhat demurely. "You're not jealous, are you, Daniel Akroyd?" Daniel laughed, shaking his head. He wouldn't admit it, even if it was true, which of course it was. "Of course I'm not. I'm not the jealous type." Constance pulled a face. He was supposed to be jealous. That was the old point. After months of soul-searching, for she'd found young William Mather very attractive and extremely good company. She'd finally made her choice. She'd decided her love for Daniel was far too important to throw away. Nonetheless, she was still young. She knew members of the opposite sex found her attractive, and, as any youngster in her position had the right to do, delighted in the knowledge. Furthermore, she very much enjoyed her flirtations with young William. The problem was, Daniel hadn't reacted the way she thought he would, and she was fearful he no longer cared for her. Now she felt the need to take steps to secure his admiration and love for her all over again. Daniel smiled as an old friend approached. He decided to tease Constance a little. "Besides, Connie, you're not my only girlfriend, you know. Good afternoon, Em. You're looking very beautiful today. Go and ask Susan for a cup. There's tea in the pot." Emma Chadwick gave him a look, surprised by his unexpected and unusual compliment. Constance pulled another face. Emma noticed, realised something was going on between Daniel and his friend, and smiled inwardly. The cotton spinner's timing couldn't have been better from Daniel's point of view, judging by Constance's look. She'd been outmanoeuvred, without a shadow of a doubt. Daniel set out down the towpath of the Rochdale Canal to make his way to Malc Platting, a small village to the north-east of Ancoats, once famed for its plaited straw hats, before felt became fashionable, hence its name. It was late autumn, and the nights were already drawing in. By the time he was making his homeward journey, it would be getting dark, but the rain had stopped, and with a bit of luck the evening would remain dry. The sheen of light from the canal should be sufficient to guide him on his way home. The job shouldn't take that long, half an hour most likely. Then he'd relax with Connie at the social, and maybe even have a dance with Emma Chadwick. The young cotton spinner had offered to teach him how to waltz. He reached the bridge where the towpath switched from one canal bank to the other, and marched up the curved cobbled slope which took the horses over the water and down the other side. Within 100 yards he climbed up the steps to a road bridge, and once having ascended them turned left over the canal, before turning right into the yard of the beehive mill. Its tall, square tower faced him at the front end of the 8-storey building, the long side of the mill running next to the canal, its loading base convenient for receiving cotton yarn for weaving, coal for its steam engine, and for dispatching finished cloth. The beehive, unlike most in Manchester, wasn't a spinning mill. A bare-headed, flaxen-haired, middle-aged man in a black suit stood at the entrance, talking to a dark-haired, surly-looking bloke who Daniel took to be an overlooker. The lad walked over towards them, his heart beating steadily. Above all, he must remain calm. "Good evening," the flaxen-haired stranger greeted him. "Mr. Akroyd from Mather's?" "Yes, Mr. West." The overlooker gave him a curt nod and departed. Daniel looked at his foe. Irene Rose had described him well all those years ago. A face like death, pale and skull-like. West didn't appear to have grasped the significance of the lad's surname. All the better, Daniel thought. I'll gain his confidence, then take him by surprise. "This way, Mr. Akroyd." West pushed open one of the imposing double doors, and led the youngster up a flight of stairs, then another and another, and then along a short echoing corridor, until he reached his office on the 3rd floor. He walked behind the large varnished and highly polished desk in the centre of the room, and stuck his hand out. Daniel passed over the folder. West began to peruse it, without speaking, or inviting the lad to sit, but Daniel was in no hurry to sit. The lad put his hand in an inside pocket, and pulled out what looked like an engineer's scribe, although it was a slightly thicker diameter, and a lot longer than a standard scribe, being exactly 12 inches from tip to tip. It was an instrument Daniel had made in the first year of his apprenticeship, utilising the finest Sheffield steel rod available, its tip honed to a perfect point, and the whole tempered and hardened to perfection. Unlike most scribes, it had a screw thread machined into its top end. In the right hands it could be driven through a thickish copper sheet with one swift blow without harming its long, delicate-looking point, especially when he'd attached its special wooden handle safe in his right-hand pocket, which screwed on and off as required. The tool could be used for scribing steel, but Daniel had taken great care never to use it for any purpose until he was ready to put it to that for which he designed and made it. He looked down at West's bowed head. There was a small bald spot appearing right in the centre. He held his scribe in one hand, gently swiping it down casually sideways on into the open palm of his other, concentrating on West's circle of pink shining scalp, surrounded by his long flaxen hair as he did so. The bald spot looked like the bullseye at the centre of a target. One swift downward blow, and the job would be done. Daniel smiled to himself, coming to terms with the fact he now held the power of life and death over the man who had taken away not only his mother's life, but that of his sibling, still developing in her womb. He took pleasure in relishing the moment of quiet before the storm, a moment anticipated for far too long. Blow for blow, blood for blood, death for death. The lust for revenge was ever so sweet, but was the time right? "Daniel!" The lad had just emerged from the mill, having taken the stairs two at a time, eager to make his escape and be on his way back to Mary's kitchen. Constance was the last person he expected to see. She was making her way hurriedly across the mill yard, looking a little anxious. "What are you doing here, Connie?" he asked calmly. The girl came towards him, a smile slowly emerging on her face. He pecked her affectionately on the cheek. "Come on, let's get away from here," he urged. "A mill that's not working is like a cold, dark mausoleum." He slipped his arm in hers. "You shouldn't have come all this way on your own, Connie. It's dangerous." His concern for her safety was all too apparent and all too realistic. This area, like Ancoats, was a dangerous place for a young girl at night. Poverty, unemployment and degradation more often than not stimulated a sense of community and a spirit of solidarity and mutual assistance amongst the majority of the working class, but a tiny minority succumbed to crime, seeking an easy way out of their misery, aping the selfishness and grasping morality of the worst cotton masters in the process. Constance was far from streetwise. They set off briskly towards the canal, shugged his arm and looked up at him. "I needed to see you, Daniel. I need to talk. I said I'd meet you at Mary's. Don't you trust me?" They turned onto the steps leading down to the canal. "I was worried, Daniel." He led the way and stopped, turning to her as they reached the last step and stepped onto the towpath. There was near enough a full moon, and it illuminated the water. An owl hooted eerily in the distance, somewhere to their right, probably from a nearby cemetery. Within moments the familiar yip yip of female answered the call. "Worried? Why should you be worried, Connie?" "I'm worried I'm losing you, Daniel." It all came out in a rush. "I've been stupid, but you need to know you mean everything to me. I love you, Daniel Akroyd. There's nobody else for me. I want you in my life forever." He gazed into her wide brown liquid eyes, not quite believing his ears. Then he laughed and put his arms around her, feeling happier than he could ever remember. He rested his head against hers, their strands of long dark hair mingling together, blown by the slight evening breeze into intimate union. He paused for a moment, savouring her scent, looking over her shoulder at the moonlight shimmering on the canal surface. For a fleeting moment it reminded him of a painting of the Grand Canal in Venice in Matthew Edrow's library. Finally he voiced the sentiments of his heart. "I love you too, Connie. I want you in my life forever as well." He caressed her long, dark, silky hair and gently kissed the lobe of her ear and then her neck above her stiff lace collar. Constance turned toward him, her heart beating fast, replete with happiness. He turned to meet her. She gazed into his dark eyes for a moment, wondering how she could express the joy and relief she felt on hearing his declaration. Then she smiled, tilted her head slightly, and offered him her lips. They kissed. Then they kissed again, this time passionately, for what seemed a long time. "Where's Constance?" Emma Chadwick looked at Irene Rose, somewhat startled by the sudden question. Constance had disappeared ages ago. "I think she's gone to meet Daniel. He should be on his way back from the Beehive Mill." Irene Rose's eyes narrowed. She hadn't planned to attend the social originally, but she'd received another letter from Janet Morrison, who had sent some rather surprising news. She wanted to share her excitement. "The Beehive? Why has Daniel gone there?" "Mr. Mather sent him. They're due to install some machinery there in the near future." She paused for a second, frowned and added, "Daniel said he had to meet a Mr. West at 7:30. "West? Not Nathaniel West?" Emma Chadwick gazed at Irene Rose in consternation, suddenly realising the implications. The way Bess Akroyd had died was folklore amongst Manchester mill workers. The mill owner's daughter looked horrified. Then Irene Rose was on her feet, remembering what Daniel had told her when he was a little boy, his long-forgotten words echoing in her mind. "I'm going to kill him. I'm going to kill the person who killed my mummy. I must find Daniel. I've got to stop him. What on earth's the matter, Miss Rose?" Before she had a chance to reply, Constance and Daniel appeared through the gap in the wall from the canal. "God, Daniel, are you all right?" "Of course I'm all right, Aunt Rose. Why shouldn't I be?" "Whatever's the matter, Mother?" Constance asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "Emma told me you'd been to meet Nathaniel West." Daniel smiled. He seemed calm and unperturbed, perhaps too calm if Rose had only thought about it. "Emma's quite right," he responded matter-of-factly. "I had to meet him to sort some practicalities out. We're supplying the Beehive Mill with 2 8-colour calico printing machines. He's provided me with the floor plan of the room they're going in." He pulled a drawing out of his folder to show her. "I was hoping he'd give me a date when he wants the work to commence, but he's still not sure. He's promised to let William Mather know by Friday." Oh, it all tripped off the tongue with such ease. Irene Rose began to feel reassured. Constance looked at her mother once more. She still looked pale and seemed worried, or at least unsure. The young girl couldn't help thinking something serious was afoot. "Are you sure you're all right, Mum?" "Yes, Constance. Don't worry. Just a moment of madness." She shook her head and smiled as the musicians struck up a tune. "Come on, let's dance." She stood up and took Emma by the hand. "You lead, I'll follow." Constance turned to Daniel. "Come on, Dan. Don't be shy. It's a waltz. I'll teach you." "You're really quite a good dancer, Dan Akroyd." "Thank you, Connie O'Donnell. You're not so bad yourself for a girl." Irene Rose smiled. The two youngsters seemed to be getting on together far better than they had in the recent past. Her worries about Daniel's meeting with West had subsided. He seemed so happy and relaxed with Constance. The lad had obviously been able to deal with it. She should never have doubted him. He was basically a sensible lad and enjoyed a maturity beyond his years. She suddenly remembered the purpose of her trip to Mary's kitchen. She rooted in her purse. "Read that, Daniel. It's from Janet Morrison. I think you'll find it of interest." She passed the letter over. Daniel felt intrigued, as did his companions. He placed it on the table in front of him, so Constance and Emma could read it. 3rd of June, 1855. "Dear Rose, you'll never guess what's happened. There's been a strike. Well, not really a strike, because the men involved are free labourers, not employees. You can't go on strike against yourself, can you? Furthermore, it was more of an armed uprising, and it looks as though all the points of the Charter, barring the one for annual parliaments, are to be implemented early next year as a result, at least in the state of Victoria. If this happens, it will give a tremendous lift to the ongoing struggle for reform throughout Australia. Let me explain. Gold was discovered last year in what is now known as the Eureka Goldfield, near the town of Ballarat. Alarmed at the number of men flocking to the goldfield, the Victoria State Government started issuing licences, subject to regular inspection, and without which the diggers, as the gold miners are known, weren't allowed to work. Inevitably, corruption amongst the police and those inspecting the licences was rife, and this, coupled with the high price demanded, naturally did not please the diggers. They saw the licence fee as an expensive tax on their own labour, which of course it was. So they informed the authorities they intended to burn the licences and would continue their search for gold. The government responded by sending in troops, and the acting Chief Justice further enraged the men by disparaging those from England and Ireland who had taken part in what he called riots back in the old country. The diggers held a meeting and passed the following resolutions, defying the troops who had descended upon them in large numbers in the process. 1. That this meeting views with the hottest indignation the daring calumny of His Honour the Acting Chief Justice, while on the bench, of the brave and struggling sufferers of Clare, Tipperary, Bristol and other districts, in their endeavours to assert their legitimate rights, and do hereby give the most determined and the most emphatic denial of the assertions of His Honour in stigmatising as riots the persevering and indomitable struggles for freedom of the brave people of England and Ireland during the last 80 years. 2. That a meeting of the members of the Reform League be called at the Adelphi Theatre on next Sunday at 2 o'clock to elect a Central Committee, and that each 50 members of the League have the power to elect one member of the Central Committee. 3. That this meeting, being convinced that the obnoxious licence fee is an imposition and an unjustifiable tax on free labour, pledges itself to take immediate steps to abolish the same by at once burning all their licences. That in the event of any party being arrested for having no licence, that the united people will, under all circumstances, defend and protect them. 4. That as the diggers have determined to pay no more licences, it is necessary for them to be prepared for the contingency, as it would be wholly consistent, after refusing to pay a licence, to call in a commissioner for the adjustments of such disputes, and that this meeting therefore resolves that when any party or parties have a dispute, the parties so disputing shall each appoint one man, the 2 men thus appointed to call in a third, and these 3 to decide the case finally. 5. That this meeting will not feel bound to protect any man after the 15th of December, who shall not be a member of the Reform League before that day. 6. That this meeting protests against the common practice of bodies of military marching into a peaceable district with fixed bayonets, and also any force, police or otherwise, firing on the people under any circumstances without the previous reading of the Riot Act, and that if government officials continue to act thus unconstitutionally, we cannot be responsible for similar or worse deeds from the people. You will not be surprised to learn the authorities, not unlike those in England, completely miscalculated the determination of the men. Troops have been brought into play, and as the final resolution indicates, they opened fire on the men without warning. However, unlike in England, the diggers are armed, not with pikes or daggers, as some in England, but with firearms. Everyone here has weapons. Not only have they resisted the troops and given as good as they've received, they are devoted Chartists, the Ballarat Reform League being their name for what is in fact to all intents and purposes the Ballarat Chartist Association. Once the men had successfully resisted the troops, the state government realised they had no alternative but to come to terms with the men. The diggers for their part made it clear they would not settle unless the state agreed to the implementation of the People's Charter. For once, the powers that be are in a cleft stick. The labouring men have control of a priceless commodity, gold in abundance, and nobody has the power to take it off them, legally or by force. The capitalists have effectively been outmanoeuvred by the workers. As I said previously, the only compromise the diggers have made is to drop the demand for annual parliaments. But the dispute is now ended, and the state government has agreed to implement the men's demand for universal male suffrage within 12 months. I will keep you updated, but the vote must inevitably be granted throughout Australia fairly soon. I'm sure. I'm so excited, it's unbelievable. And yet it's true. David just keeps saying, "I told you so, Anne, I told you so." Give my and the family's love to all, and a special hug to young Daniel. All my love, Janet Morrison. "That's wonderful news," Daniel said with a laugh. "This Australia sounds a really special and exciting place, and all I have to do is commit a serious crime, and I'll be transported free of charge." "Daniel Akroyd, you've just told me you want me in your life forever. What if I don't want to go?" Irene Rose looked across at Constance. Her eldest daughter appeared to be extremely indignant at her newly confirmed beau's complete lack of consultation. Irene Rose turned her attention back to Daniel. "Have you young people something to tell me?" she asked. Daniel's face broke into a mischievous smile, of the kind Irene Rose had witnessed many times before. "I think Connie asked me to marry her earlier this evening, and—" "Dan Akroyd, I never did." Constance's face was a picture of embarrassment, a portrait in scarlet, you might say. "Constance, my love," Irene Rose interjected, "you just said Daniel had indicated he wanted you to be in his life forever. And you also indicated that that was what you wanted, or else you wouldn't have protested about him going to Australia, would you? Who exactly raised the subject in the first place, you or Daniel?" "Well, Constance began to blush a deeper shade of red. Irene Rose laughed. "Whoever asked who doesn't really matter, children. Am I right in thinking you'd like to marry Constance, Daniel?" "Yes. Once I've completed my apprenticeship and I'm earning sufficient to provide for her." "And do you feel the same way, Constance?" "Yes, mother," she replied quietly, before quickly adding, "but I'm not having any man supporting me. I'm quite capable of supporting myself. Thank you ever so much, Daniel Akroyd." Irene Rose smiled, more than delighted with the news. "Good for you, Constance. In that case, you have my blessing, and I'm sure Michael's approval will be a foregone conclusion." Emma Chadwick, who sat quietly as the events unfolded, stood up, smiled in her turn, and kissed Daniel on his forehead, ruffling his hair in the process. "Good lad, our Daniel. I told you it would all work out right at the end," she remarked, a huge grin lighting up her face, as though she and Daniel had planned this outcome many months before. Whether this was the case or otherwise, she was obviously as pleased as her companions were. She pulled her shawl up over the top of her head and fastened it at the neck with her brooch, the evening having turned decidedly chilly, despite the warmth of the social atmosphere. "Good night, Miss Rose. Good night, young lovers. I'll see thee when I sees thee." With that, the young cotton spinner left to make her way home, her iron-clad clogs ringing out on the cobbles, sounding a cheerful note, as if ringing in a new era. Chapter 8. "Daniel?" The lad looked up from his work. Mr. Mather sounded agitated. "What is it, sir?" "I thought they told me West had promised to be in touch afore th' end o' week." The lad nodded agreement, put his scraping tool down, and picked up an oily rag. "That's right, Mr. Mather, he did," he responded. "Well, he hasna been. I reckon we'd best chase him up. I've 2 machines standing idle. We need to pin him down. Sooner we get job done, sooner we get our cash. Do you want me to go and see him tonight?" "No, it's Friday, bugger now. He'll be going home early. Lazy bastard don't work at weekends. Agin his religion, he says." "I don't mind going on my own, Mr. Mather. There's no need for you to be wasting your time." "No, we'll go together. You show me the way. I'll do negotiating. He's a tricky bugger from what I've been told." Daniel nodded again. "I'll get me hat and coat." He took off his work apron, hung it over his workbench vise, and went to the row of hooks on the wall to pick up his outer clothing, a smile on his face. "Right, Daniel, let's be off. We'll catch omnibus to Stevenson Square off Howdham Street, and then one up Howdham Road." They were soon out of the factory and making their way onto Chapel Street. A small crowd of people were waiting at the omnibus stop. "Bloody hell!" William exclaimed. "Who'd have thought so many people could afford bus and not be working?" Daniel remained quiet. He was working and still couldn't afford to travel on an omnibus. The thought passed through his head that perhaps he should ask for a pay increase. William stuck his hand out as the horse-drawn double-decker approached. They were the last passengers on the boarding platform, and the conductor stuck his hand out for payment as he pulled the leather cord to ring the bell to signal the driver to move the horses into action. "Have they any pennies on there, lad?" Daniel looked at his employer for a brief moment. He had the idea this might be another test. Either way, he had no money apart from the penny Aunt Rose had sewn into his jacket lining for emergencies. He shook his head. "I'll see thee upstairs," William told the conductor. "I needs to find me wallet." The conductor grimaced, thinking passengers should have learnt by now they should have the right change ready when they boarded, but he didn't bar their way. The omnibus wended its way down Chapel Street and swung left onto Victoria Street, much to William's concern. He'd expected it to swing right and then left, to make its way up Fennell Street past the old collegiate church, which was now the cathedral, Manchester having been made a diocese of the Church of England in 1847 and granted city status in 1853. At that point, the conductor puffed his way upstairs to collect their fares. "I thought this bus went into Manchester." The conductor looked at William as though he had no sense. "Nay, lad, we terminate at Victoria Railway Station, as it plainly states on front and side of vehicle in great big letters. That'll be twopence each, please." "Twopence each? That's no but daylight robbery. I usually pay a penny to Howdham Street." "Twopence per person per trip is the fare. It's an express service. Limited stop to get people to their station on time. Highly efficient and all it be, or it would be, if there were less traffic on road. Far too many middle-class folks with pony and traps clogging up road and filling it with horse shit, if you ask me." William Mather shook his head at the conductor's blatant class prejudices and contradictions, feeling extremely exasperated. "There you are," he said sharply, handing over the coppers. "I won't be travelling with you again. Mark me words." "I hope not," the conductor thought, but he kept it to himself and smiled patiently as his passenger stood up to disembark. Young Daniel allowed himself a smile and winked at the conductor sympathetically as he passed. "Right, lad, I reckon we mun walk from here. I can't afford lavish expenses. Let's get a move on." "All right, Mr. Mather, but we'll cut up this way onto Swan Street. We'll soon be up Oldham Road." "Have you nae bread left now, Susan? There's fresh bread in oven ready to be picked up after t' mill's finish, Emma. Do they want a loaf?" "Aye, a 2-pounder. I'll pick it up just after 6. How's your mother?" "She's fine, Sue. Still working hard, as she always has." The spinner finished her tea and replaced the cup in the saucer. "Reet gradely that, Susan. I'll see thee at 6. Susan nodded and began to clear the table as Emma began to leave to make her way back to the mill after the afternoon break. "Emma, can I have a quick word before you go?" The lass turned round at the sound of the voice. "What is it, Connie, love?" "I just wanted to thank you for being so understanding." Emma frowned. "How do they mean, Constance?" "Well, you know, about Daniel and me." "Let me tell you summat, young Connie O'Donnell. Me and our Daniel go back a long, long time. In fact, we go back longer than either of us can remember. We grew up together, and we had all kind of adventures together. I love him, and that's a fact. I love him more than I'd love me own brother if scarlet fever hadn't got poor lad. I'd stand by him if he were done for murder, which he ne'er will, 'cause he's so loving and gentle and so kind. I want our Daniel to be happy, and I know you make him happy. Thee aren't made for him, and he's made for thee. End of story." "Well, that's a right rum do, Daniel." The lad and his employer were walking down the towpath of the Rochdale Canal. They'd been to the Beehive Mill and asked to see Nathaniel West. Much to William's disappointment, the woman at the front office told them he wasn't in work. She'd shown them up to the 5th floor and introduced them to Mr. Jamieson, the mill superintendent. He'd informed them the last time he'd seen West was on the previous Monday evening at 6:30, when he himself had finished work, this being the night young Daniel met him. William had asked if he had the authority to sanction the work in his employer's absence, but Jamieson said he hadn't. Then he come out with a statement that had essentially made William worried. "To be quite frank with you, Mr. Mather, I'm surprised Mr. West is even thinking about putting in new machinery. I don't believe we have the demand for it. Trade is very bad at the moment, unless he knows something I don't. I'm looking at laying off hands over the next few weeks." He'd locked on to William's eyes and then backtracked, fearing he might have said too much. After all, confidence between clients and suppliers could be all important. "Maybe that's why he's not been into work. He's probably chasing new orders. He's quite a salesman when he's a mind to concentrate on the job in hand." William Mather's eyebrows had raised a good half-inch at this juncture. "Good salesman? Talented bloody bullshitter, more like," he thought to himself. "And you're not doing so bad this hell on that front, Mr. Jamieson." Out loud he'd said, "I'll wish you good afternoon, Mr. Jamieson. Come on, our Daniel. I reckon we're wasting precious time here." Daniel had merely nodded and smiled his quiet smile once more. All was going well from his point of view, and he was sure William would soon find another customer for his machines in the absence of West. "Mr. Mather, can I suggest we return by the canal? I'd like you to meet some friends of mine, and I'll treat you to one of the best cups of tea in Manchester." "Your treat, Daniel? Are you sure?" The lad nodded. "In that case, lad, I'm going to have a look at your pay. You shouldn't be able to afford to treat your boss. I get special—" William Mather laughed aloud. Daniel looked and felt flabbergasted. He slapped the lad on the back. "Only testing, Daniel, only testing. I'll pay for tea." "No, I'm not serving you, and that's final. Up it." Susan Openshaw stood bracing herself, legs apart, hands firmly splayed on the counter. "I want a cup of tea, and I'll have a cup of tea. Amy, Amy, come here quick." Daniel and William looked across from their table, their attention attracted by Susan's shouting. Amy Peduzzi and Anna Sutcliffe came rushing out of the kitchen. Anna stopped stock still in her tracks, her eyes riveted on the man stood before her, clearly in shock. "Well, well, you've grown into a right buxom wench, Anna," the would-be customer sneered. "Spend lots of time on your back, do they, lass?" he asked offensively. Daniel suddenly realised who the man was. He'd seen him on his first visit to the Beehive. The man he'd assumed to be an overlooker. "There's nowt for you here, Jed Smith. We don't serve rapists, particularly them what rapes childer," Amy retorted. "Now be off with you, afore I knock your bleeding head off your shoulders." Without another word, she produced a cast-iron ladle from behind her back, swung it by its long wooden handle, and smashed it down on the counter with great force. Jed Smith jumped back like a scalded cat, barely able to remove his fingers off the counter quick enough. "Bastards!" he shouted. "You tossing set of bastards!" "You pathetic little maggot," Amy retorted sharply. "Be off with you, 'cause next time I willna miss. I'll have your head off. God be me witness." Smith brought his head back and tried to spit at her, but failed miserably. The gob of dull green spittle ended up running down his chin. Having displayed his manliness, he turned on his heels and left, walking fast. Hannah Sutcliffe burst into tears. The memory of the torment and hell the overlooker had put her through all those many years before, when she'd first started work in Gibraltar Mill at the age of 12, flooding back into her mind. Amy Peduzzi put her arms around her friend, remembering all too well the sexual torment she too had suffered as a young apprentice at Quarrybank. "Come on, Hannah," she said gently. "We have to be strong, or else he's won. We mustna let ourselves be victims forever. It's o'er and done with, lass. We have to live our lives for ourselves, and them we love, and we know love us. Jed Smith's but a midden of slimy shit, and always will be. He's no fit to lick your clogs." "Well, I never," William Mather said to Daniel. "Young women soon sorted him out. What were that all about?" "I don't know, Mr. Mather, but I'll find out." Daniel went over to the counter. Amy and Anna had returned to their work. "What was going on, Susan?" "Jed Smith were an overlooker at Gibraltar Mill when Anna first started working there as an apprentice. He were forcing Anna to have sex with him until Miss Irene Rose found out and sacked him. Anna were barely 12 at time. It don't bear thinking about.